everybody, it's Eric Pappenfoos. It's Black Friday, so it must be a buy day. Thanks for helping make last week's buy day our very first buy day to climb within the first week to 500 views on YouTube. It was on the Kennedy assassination 60th anniversary. I'm glad you watched that, and I hope you'll consider, if you haven't already, to like and subscribe to our YouTube page, which you can do by clicking the bell, and that'll send you reminders every Friday at noon when we have new content on Buy Day Friday. Now, today's episode is sort of a follow-up, Amanda, to one we did 9 months or so ago about the Kemble family, a family of famous British actors and actresses from the 19th century. Why? Well, because we found an amazing book in a box lot this past week, and let's get right to it. Now, sometimes at auctions, Amanda, if they don't catalog the books, they'll just put a bunch of miscellaneous things in a box and people will bid on that box. Sometimes you get a chance to look at it, sometimes you don't. Well, in the box was a completely nondescript book. Had no idea what it was, but it looked like somebody had put a new modern rebound spine on what was a pretty Victorian book. So they'd obviously cared about this book, which intrigued me, but I didn't know what it was, and I decided to buy the box lot. Well, when I got the book home and I opened up the book, it turned out that it was owned by the very famous actress, Fanny Kemble. Now, we'll put a link in our comments to a previous buy day we did on Fanny Kemble and her journal about visiting the plantation in Georgia, where her husband had slaves, and she became a very prominent abolitionist, but she was also a very, very famous actress. And Butler Place was her home in the Philadelphia area, in Germantown, which is now a part of LaSalle University. There is a memorial garden for Fanny Kemble where the house used to be. Now, if you look at the front of the book, Amanda, you'll see that she has signed her name on the beautiful color title page. There's Fanny Kemble up there. Yep. And you will also see that she gave the book away. At one point, she gave this book to a James Coleman. This is probably the reason the book survived. She had a very messy divorce from Pierce Butler. She didn't get to keep any of the books that were in her original library. So the fact that this one escaped and maybe descended in the Coleman family is why we can find it today. At LaSalle University, they do have a handful of books that came from Butler Place. This is an interesting book, not only because it was owned by Fanny Kemble, Amanda, but also because it was designed by a very famous Victorian book designer. Here's a copy of the title page, named Owen Jones. And he is famous for a book he did called Grammar of Ornaments, and he's considered the sort of father of Victorian British design, interior design. These scallop-shaped designs. Let's look at some of the Owen Wister designs for this book. Wow. All very Victorian. And Fanny had high British taste, and she would have really enjoyed this book. And it is The Complete Works of the Latin poet Horace. Now, that is important as well, because later in life, Fanny returned to the stage, so to speak, by giving readings of Shakespeare plays. She wouldn't act in them, but she'd sit and read, and people would come from all around to see her read Shakespeare's great works, which she did in both the United Kingdom and in America. One of her favorite plays to read was Antony and Cleopatra. And Horace is considered the source material for Shakespeare for the play Antony and Cleopatra. And this book contains the very famous Ode to Cleopatra, which Horace wrote about the Battle of Actium, in which, Antony and Cleopatra were defeated. And it's in Latin, but usa et jacentem viscera regiam voltus oreno fortis et asperas tractare serpentes ut etrum, and that basically translates into, she dared endure the sight of her realm in ruins, her face serenely calm, and had the strength to handle stinging serpents to absorb their black venom into her body. Ooh. So the whole serpent story also was made famous by Horace. So you have a book that probably inspired her interpretation of Shakespeare, certainly was beautifully designed, and was a part of her library. Pretty interesting book to find in a box lot. But that wasn't the only book that we got at auction. One of the cataloged books that we got at auction was this 2-volume set, which is just absolutely gorgeous, and it is a signed binding, extra illustrated, on the life of Sarah Siddons. And if you recall, Fanny was the niece of Sarah Siddons and John Philip Kemble. Now, we also did a By Day episode on Grangerization, which was the process of extra illustrating books. And this is a great example because whoever owned this book had it rebound with added plates, one after the other after another. 60 or so plates put into the book, extra illustrating it. And look what we find in the back of the Sarah Siddons book. There is Fanny Kemble in her first role as Juliet. That's how she made her name, starting out as Juliet in the early years, long before she gave those readings. But the book is also interesting, Amanda, because it contains 2 manuscript letters. And if you zoom in, I want to show you one more thing. It's a signed binding. Oftentimes when you have famous binders or extra illustrated works, the binder would put their name. But there's also manuscripts bound in. And if you look closely, here is a letter from John Philip Kemble that interestingly mentions the theaters in Drury Lane and in Covent Garden. Can you see that? And those were where he managed and where Fanny sort of learned how to act and learned about the theater. And in volume 1, most interestingly of all, I think, is a very rare letter by Sarah Siddons herself. And, well, first we start with a portrait of Shakespeare. You got to start there. But there's the letter from Sarah Siddons. And I like this letter, Amanda, too, because it says, hey, thanks for your kind invitation. And I hope to have the pleasure of seeing you in the dressing room. Whoa, after the show. Well, that was pretty common, so I'm sure they were coming. Also in the book are some pictures of there's Sarah Siddons herself, but there's also a portrait of the great stage actor David Garrick.
Wow.
And we're going to end today with a book by David Garrick, which is important because David Garrick was a great book collector. He used to amass a library going auction to auction. He amassed thousands of books, and eventually, after he passed away and his wife passed away, those books were dispersed at auctions. And Garrick, too, has a Latin book. In this case, Garrick's book is Sallust, the great Roman historian Sallust, published in Amsterdam. And this book is also Shakespearean source material, which would make sense for why Garrick would own the book, because Sallust wrote some of the earliest descriptions of his friend and patron, Julius Caesar. So if you want to portray Julius Caesar, you probably want to understand Julius Caesar's thirst for power, his greatness, his virtue in many respects. Well, Sallust wrote about that. And look what the book has in the front. It has David Garrick's bookplate before the library was dispersed. Why this one survived, we're not sure. It was probably purchased at auction. Note that his bookplate has Shakespeare up at the top. Now, one slightly amusing story, which I would like to tell you, is that David Garrick's teacher was Dr. Samuel Johnson. We all know Samuel Johnson and his dictionary. Well, Samuel Johnson taught, among other things, Latin to David Garrick and was not pleased with his students' comprehending of Latin. He wrote, "He is not Latin enough. He finds out the Latin by the meaning rather than the meaning by the Latin."
I see.
Which I think basically means he has to go to a dictionary and look it up. And isn't that rich for a dictionary maker like Samuel Johnson to be complaining about? Also, Samuel Johnson quite famously once went to Garrick's library and went through all his books, hurling them around the room, possibly picking up this huge quarto and throwing it around the room and saying, "This is trash, this is trash, this is trash. You need better books in your library, Mr. David Garrick." So, books owned by famous actors. Now, we're going to end today with a funny book. This one is in honor of Fanny Kemble's grandson. Fanny Kemble's grandson is a great American author by the name of Owen Wister, and he is the founder of cowboy fiction. He is the first person to write about cowboys in the West in a romantic-sized way. The Hollywood cowboy really came out of Owen Wister's work. And he would therefore approve of this 1972 cult classic, which is The Manly Art of Knitting. And yes, the author decided that he could make knitting more attractive if he marketed knitting to cowboys and to men. And specifically, if he suggested you could both knit and ride a horse at the same time, which is difficult to do, and would always take time to knit for your horse.
Aww,
The
nice.
Manly Art of Knitting this week's funny book. Well, I hope you watch next Friday and every Friday at noon for more adventures in the world of books on Buy Day Friday.